and turn this webinar over to Chuck Mills, California ReLeaf's Director of Grants and Public Policy. So he's the guy who knows this stuff, and you're lucky to hear from him today. He has a lot of great information for you, and here he is. Chuck, take it away.
Good morning. Thank you, Melissa. Notice that she didn't say whether it was good luck or bad luck, just luck. But I do appreciate the introduction, and thank everyone for being on the line today. We feel like we've really assembled a good panel of folks to speak to really some very basic common sense tips in grant writing that can really translate into big dollars or even smaller, medium-sized grants for your organization, depending on capacity. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time with introductions. We're just going to kind of dig right into it. And one of the motivations for this webinar today is that we're really looking at a snapshot in time in California around urban forestry, urban green infrastructure. If you look at this chart, you don't have to go back very far to see that we were really on the brink of having no real available funding for urban forestry only a couple years ago. And a couple of things have really turned around in California, and one of them is being able to separate out urban forestry rather than just a be-all, end-all, to be able to bifurcate the various benefits of urban forestry and translate those into public benefit, whether it relates to reducing greenhouse gases or managing stormwater or improving active transportation. All of those issues and others that you see identified in this chart have really translated into public dollars in California over the last several years, to where now you can see us approaching this $700 million mark of funds that are available in some capacity for urban forestry. A lot of those funds admittedly are through like Prop 39, which is energy efficiency upgrades and tying energy to schools and school districts, local education agencies, but tree planting is an eligible project there. There's new grants through the Strategic Growth Council that speak to affordable housing and sustainable communities. Those grants have just been revised and they'll be approved this Thursday, which bring into those incentives to do urban green infrastructure, tree planting, open space, parks. A lot of these other programs, all of which you can find on our website at californiareleaf.org, have a lot more explicit detail about how they can tie into the projects you may be interested in funding. So we encourage you to look at that, and this has really been the motivation for what we're trying to achieve in getting the word out about how to take a common sense approach to grant writing, but also some strategic tips to maximize your opportunity to get funded. In addition to what I've just discussed, we're not even talking about what we believe is going to be on the horizon. As many of you know, CAL FIRE's Urban and Community Forestry Program was funded in 14-15 with $18 million in greenhouse gas reduction funds. In the next fiscal year, the legislature didn't take action on a lot of greenhouse gas reduction funds investments, including urban forestry, but there's an effort underway in Sacramento to ensure that that happens when they get back in January. If it doesn't happen in January, there's still a possibility of it happening later in the legislative year as we look at the next 3-year investment plan for greenhouse gas reduction funds and climate investments. That's on the horizon. There are a lot of stakeholders in especially the Los Angeles area and in Sacramento who want to see a new green infrastructure program that can tie urban greening to sustainable community strategies or regional climate action plans and bring in that green infrastructure at the beginning of the design build phase in urban and rural areas. Prop 1, which was passed by the voters about 1.5 years ago, had $20 million that goes to the Resources Agency for an urban watersheds program. They're going to be developing those guidelines, and those are going to be directly pertinent to urban forestry and urban green infrastructure. And then the legislature passed in the budget this past year $10 million for the outdoor environmental education program. There is no grant guidelines for that, but that's something else that we're going to see on the horizon. So the opportunities are really unprecedented, and that's really what this webinar is about, is trying to get participants to maximize those opportunities. So the bottom line is that those funds are out there in large increments, existing grant programs, grant programs with a minimum as much as $20,000 and a maximum of $5 million. across the board, there should be something for everybody. And the question is, are we going to be able to harness your potential to go out there and get those funds? So like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with introductions. We really want to get down to business. Today's webinar, as you know, we're going to focus on tips for successful grant writing. We're really fortunate to have with us two other colleagues that have done tremendous work in maximizing their ability to partner with others to get grants, both large and small, creating opportunities for urban forestry by following just practices and strategies that they developed over the years. Brian Kemph is the Executive Director for Urban Tree Foundation, an urban forestry group located in Visalia. Kelaine Ravdin is the founder and CEO of Urban Ecos. She also has 3 years experience with the U.S. Forest Service prior to founding Urban Ecos. We're really thrilled to have both of them with us today. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Brian.
Hi, folks. We're going to talk about how we kind of do the grant process and actually deliver the projects here in Visalia. And partnerships are critical. And the foundation developed a now long-standing partnership with Community Services Employment Training and the City of Visalia. And of course, we work with all sorts of other agency and group partners to deliver green projects in our community. And partnerships are really about people. And what we found is that it is critical when dealing with municipalities that you develop a relationship not with just council, but you develop a relationship with city managers, parks department heads, all the way down to maintenance workers. And you have to work really closely with people to be successful. And then with CSAT, which is a at-risk youth conservation corps organization. And what they do is they target young folks that have perhaps gotten in trouble and do not have their high school education, and they go to school and get their high school education as well as get valuable work training. And why that's important is the agencies really like to see the at-risk youth, or the granting agencies really like to see at-risk youth being employed in the learning trades. The partners all work to identify the needs within the community. City manager, us, the folks at CSAT, we're always looking around the community for opportunities. Street corridors that need street trees. We have a lot of waterway trails in Visalia, ponding basins, and so we have an ongoing list of projects in which we need to fund. We identify the funding because you have to work within the spirit of the grant, and there's lots of different grant opportunities. As Chuck was mentioning, in the last 10 years, the foundation has brought in over $20 million in outside fundings for green projects. And there's some grants that are not on this list, but everything from EEMP grants to ICE-T to TAP. Whoops, my computer just acted up. To various sorts of ATP and California ReLeaf Strategic Growth Council. And there are various things, as Chuck mentioned, such as the ReLeaf website has grants listed, and things like the UFI site at Cal Poly. And then we're on email listservs for things like, we just got this one today. The city contacted us about putting together a grant application to reduce turf and do more native landscapes in the public spaces. When you're drafting a budget or when you're drafting the grant, it is a fair bit of work. And some applications, such as CAL FIRE and California ReLeaf, are very user-friendly sort of applications. They're certainly not all that way. For example, the environmental enhancement mitigation, by the time you're finished with that grant application, it's probably a 50 to 60 page document. But what's important, and one of the strategies that we use, of course, after reading all the guidelines, is we actually take the questions that are in the application and we cut them into Word and simply answer the questions. We try to be succinct in the questions when we're answering them. What you have to realize is the reviewers may have to read 100 applications. You definitely want to tell your story and tell it well, but length does not necessarily help you. Then you have to, of course, put together a budget, and the budget has to be defendable and real, and it is critical that you put enough resources to actually deliver the project. If you under budget, that can lead to some real big problems in the implementation of the project. And then, of course, there's the environmental documents. And California ReLeaf and CAL FIRE do a kind of catch-all environmental documents which are self-check, whereas ATP or EEM, you have to do CEQA. And we often do what's called a categorical exemption, which is a minor alteration of the land, meaning we're not doing any major excavation past irrigation trenching, but it's important to do the environmental documents correct. The city often files those, but we do the environmental investigation on their behalf. And then, of course, you have to do a plan. And we don't do a fancy plan for the grant. Plans do take time and resources to put together. You don't need full construction drawings at this point, but it is very helpful to have a good plan that makes sense to the reviewers. Once you kind of develop that grant application and you get it in, and if all goes well, you get funded. And I'm going to kind of, because we've put about $20 million worth of projects in the ground in Visalia, I'm going to kind of touch base on what that process is. When you develop a partnership with the municipality, it is incredibly important for them to trust you and do a good job with the projects. And I'm going to go over some of what we do to deliver these sorts of things. And our office in particular has the ability to do AutoCAD sort of construction plans. Not every nonprofit has the ability to do that. Most cities, when you operate in the right-of-way and you're doing plantings, require things such as encroachment permits and full AutoCAD construction drawings. And we submit encroachment permits and construction drawings as private industry. If you're a smaller nonprofit, you can certainly contract out with a landscape architecture firm to do these sorts of things for you, but it is critical that in the budget process that you account for either the resources to do it in-house or to contract out to do the plans. And they're normal sophisticated plans with details and specifications. The next thing that the foundation does, once we go through and get all the signatures and all the plans and everything is signed off and we're ready to go, is we actually manage the construction for the partnership. Again, it's a three-tiered partnership. The city, we're working within their right-of-way. they are typically the lead agency, even though we write the grant. They're the fiscal sponsor, and then of course CSET is the construction arm, and we're the management arm. So we take projects like this, and this happens to be a Caltrans right-of-way, and working in Caltrans right-of-way is somewhat tricky. We have to do 2 sets of plan checks on this sort of thing where it gets submitted to Caltrans as well as the city, and 2 sets of encroachment permits. And these are busy sites. This is actually a highway that goes through the downtown, and it takes a lot of preparation to be able to do this sort of project. Cut all the concrete, jackhammer it all out. There's traffic all around you. You have to do traffic control plans. And then to deliver this sort of project, as I mentioned, Visalia has a lot of waterways, and these sorts of projects or these sorts of sites lend themselves to Class 1 bicycle trails, and we build quite a few of these. We'll take a site such as this, and we'll add irrigation. We work with the community once the Corps puts in all the infrastructure, and we plant these sort of sites, and it transforms the site. I do not have a recent picture. This now has a Class 1 bicycle trail. And also basins are critical in our area. And what we've found is they make habitat. This is actually a stormwater basin as well as recharge basin. And the sort of thing that we do is we move the fence down to high water mark. So you're not looking at a chain link fence at the edge of the right-of-way. And then we grade the site. We provide irrigation to the site. Even though we're using California natives, you still need irrigation to get the plants up and running and get them through periods of extreme drought such as we're having now. And these are large projects. And we work really hard to educate the youth on proper construction and work with the youth to develop a skill, and that's very important from the funding agency, and it's a great selling point that we put into the grants that really, I believe, helps us be successful in grant awards. The foundation has about a 95% success rate on its grant applications. And we develop a site such as this that folks use, as opposed to a chain link site or chain link at the edge of the right-of-way. So another really important thing that we offer to our agency partners is we actually track the grants and prepare all the billing for the municipality. Which is no small task in itself. And one of the strategies that we've used that, in my eyes, is very effective, and my computer will not go to the next screen, unfortunately. There it goes. Is we use the Google Drive. And we develop a system because we may have 3 or 4 grants operating any one time. And we use the Google Drive system to keep track of all the invoices and paper that's involved in this process. And there's an incredible amount of invoicing and procurement involved, and this is the most cost-effective, easy way we've found to keep track of it. We simply scan the receipts, we organize them, and then we have a running Excel spreadsheet that tracks the expenditures in accordance to the budget. And then finally, we close the grants out. We meet with the granting agencies to review the project, do the final billing, and close the project out. We found that working as a team, the 3 entities working very closely together, has positioned our community in a way that agencies really like to fund our applications. It's also really important that you do a very good job in the field, because often they're the same reviewers year after year. So when the Strategic Growth Council works with the resources agency, it's the same group of people that come and do your pre-site visit, close your grant out, that read your applications next year. So it's not just about getting the money, it's about delivering the project well for the community, and so you can ask for resources again. That's really my take on the process of grants. It's really important to develop those partnerships, understand what you need, have a good handle on the funding, be able to write or develop a good application. If you can't design the site in-house, that you have a private firm that you can work with to develop it. Understand the construction process, the tracking process, and also how to properly close a grant out. From here, I'm going to end my presentation and send it over to Kathleen.
All right, so this is Kelaine here. Let's see. Can anybody let me know if they can see my screen properly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And thanks, Brian, for that. I hope that people won't find our presentations too repetitive, but if they do, it just means that the things we had to say were obviously very, very important. So I'm just going to dive right in with what I'm calling my 6 tips for grant applications, based on the things that I've done successfully or mistakes that I've made or seen made in the past. So I'll have some illustrations of examples from those experiences, and also I've pulled out some bits and pieces from the 4 grant applications currently open on California ReLeaf's site that I thought were sort of the most relevant, and that either are currently open or will be open, or hopefully will be open in the immediate future. And those are the Cal EPA's Environmental Justice Grant, California ReLeaf's grant itself that is due at the middle of January, Cal Fire's big tree planting grant that just closed out for last year, but we're hoping very much that there'll be money available again this year, in the coming year. And then California Department of Transportation's Active Transportation Program grant, which just closed for 2015, but it sounds like there's expected to be another set of funding in 2016. So tip number 1 for a successful grant application is respect the grant objectives. So in my experience, well, let's just say this. The grantor will always tell you what the objective of the grant is. And so you want to look through the material and find that as it's the most important thing that you can do. So the first one here is Cal Fire's Green Trees for the Golden State Grant Program. And it says very clearly the objective is to provide tree planting projects in urban areas with an emphasis on greenhouse gases. The Active Transportation Program's guidelines say they want to encourage increased active modes of transportation, such as biking and walking. So the first one is a tree planting program with greenhouse gas focus, and the second one is really about encouraging biking and walking. So I think this is important for a couple of reasons. One is that we tend to have our heart set on certain projects. We have a great project in mind, and we often attempt to shoehorn it into a place that it really doesn't fit, just because we're so much in love with it. And one of the big challenges there is that most of these grants are, they were designed, they have enabling legislation associated with them. So the amount that that the grantor is able to be flexible in accepting certain kinds of projects is really limited by legislation. So, for example, one project that one grant application that I participated in a minor way on was for a tree planting grant, and the proposal was primarily an enormous research project with research targeting different, that had a different end goal. It wasn't really about what the grant was about, and it had a tiny bit of tree planting associated with it. The cost for the trees and their oversight was maybe 10% of the grant, and the other 90% was for research into a different topic. It was a really great project, and that's why I agreed to participate, but it really didn't stand a snowball's chance of surviving because most of the money was really going to something that did not match the grant objectives. And so I think that one way it's helpful to think about this, because we have our heart set on these projects, and it's hard to give up and admit that we really just have to find a different place for it, and that the grant we might be applying for is not appropriate. I try to think of it in terms of this process. So in most of these cases, the people of California have spoken, either through the voting process or through working with their legislators, and said, here's what we want you to do with our tax money. We want you to focus on these goals. Maybe it's greenhouse gases, maybe it's active transportation, maybe it's disadvantaged communities. And the people are telling the legislature that that's what they want to do. And the legislature votes to appropriate the money and make use of it based on what they've heard from the people. And then they pass that money on and the general perspective on to these different state agencies and say, we want you to carry out these goals that have been presented to us. So when you really focus on the grant objectives and you respect and honor them, you're really honoring and respecting the process that happened here, the process that the voters, the way that the voters spoke and the way that the legislature worked with these issues. And then in most of these cases, the final guidelines were developed in a public process. So here's a quote that comes straight from that biking and walking grant program, saying that the guidelines were developed by the work group, and the work group includes representatives from Caltrans, other government agencies, and active transportation stakeholder organizations. So people have already had a voice in saying how these guidelines would be developed. I think it's really important that we honor their work by finding a way to do a program that meets those objectives. And another way to think about this is there's somebody sitting at a desk with a stack, as Brian said, of 100 grant applications. That person is not high. It's not the governor reading the grant applications. It's a mid-level CAL FIRE. It's our CAL FIRE urban foresters. They don't have the ability to override the demands of the legislature and the government and say, well, this project was so good, we should just give it money, even though it's not what people were asking us to fund. So I'm hammering this point in because I think that it happens all too often that we talk ourselves into the idea that we can convince the grantor that our project is so good it doesn't matter that it doesn't match the objectives. So drawing from that, once we have a project that broadly meets the objectives of the grant, it's important, tip number 2, to tell your story the right way. So even if in your mind the project matches the objectives, you have to tell the story so that the reader understands what you were thinking. And so first you want to do that at the big scale. And so for me that means finding these program goals, which are always in the grant application. And so here I've highlighted something from the Cal EPA grants program. There's a project goals, which is section B, and there are 5 of them. Number 2 is the one that seemed to me that was sort of most related to the urban forestry world, and it was address climate change impacts through community-led solutions. And so when you're telling your story, when you go to write your grant application, and in fact when you design your project, remember, let's just imagine that you're a nonprofit and your goal is to plant some trees. So you're thinking of this as a tree planting project, but the California EPA is thinking of this instead, it's not to them, it's not a tree planting project. There are all kinds of ways to accomplish this program goal of addressing climate change impacts. To them it's a project, and I've taken this bullet here straight from the text, to moderate the effects of climate change in disadvantaged communities. So when you're writing, stop thinking about planting trees and start thinking about how you can talk about this project in a narrative way as a project that moderates the effects of climate change. So that's at the big scale. I think it's also important to tell your story right at the smaller scale. And so that means don't be afraid to make use of the language that the grantor has written into the grant. This might feel a little bit fake, but I think that, again, imagine there's this person sitting there with a stack of 100 grant applications trying to figure out which ones are a best match for the goals that they're trying to achieve. And so here I've highlighted in this section of the goals the things that jumped out at me as being relevant to how we might tell a story, for example, about a tree planting project. So what they're looking for are projects, they're concerned about disadvantaged communities that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of a rapidly changing climate. And they're looking for solutions to climate change, but also solutions that provide economic and public health benefits. And then they helpfully give us some examples of projects that they would like to give money for. So I'm saying don't be afraid to use those words, like those exact words almost. I'm going to be a little subtle about it, but those exact words generally when you talk about the project, when you fill out the grant application. So I threw this together in 2 minutes. Please don't copy this executive summary for the project that you have in your minds. But the Cal EPA asks you to write an executive summary of 4 or 5 sentences that really hammers home how the project meets the objectives. And so the writer highlights the places where I've really just taken their exact words, turned them around into slightly different sentences, and explained how my proposed tree planting project will in fact mitigate the challenges of a rapidly changing climate. How does it address energy efficiency, which is one of the things on their list? How will it improve the local economy? I'm going to tell them that just in a couple of sentences. They talk about improving public health and increasing biking and walking. And another reason that I think that this is very important is for these four programs in particular, 2 of them are grant, the 4 grants that I'm talking about today. 2 are grants from urban forestry-based organizations. There's the Cal ReLeaf one, and then there's the Cal Fire one that we hope comes open. But when we're thinking of the Cal EPA or the active transportation programs, the people reading your grant application are not tree people. So it's not going to be obvious to them really at all in how trees help to mitigate climate change, increase energy efficiency, improve the local economy. We know those things because we've been paying attention to the research and the publications that have come out in the many years in the past. But EPA people and the biking and walking people don't really know anything about the things that we know. So we really want to help them. We want to connect these pieces that they've told us about, rapidly changing climate, solutions to climate change, economic benefits, and weave them together with the story of trees so that they don't have to spend a lot of mental energy trying to figure it out. So just one more quick example of telling your story right. This is the active transportation program goals. And the first one that jumped out to me was they want to increase the proportion of trips accomplished by biking and walking. And so my brain says, how do we do that with trees? And I think, well, let's talk about shade, let's talk about human comfort, especially in disadvantaged communities. Let's think about how it's not very nice to walk or ride your bicycle if the blazing sun is beating down on you at 110 degrees. So how can we make those major pathways of walking and biking more comfortable and more beautiful? I could tell that story all day long. But as I continue to read the goals, I see, oh, look, they have this other one that's also relevant, enhance public health, including the reduction of childhood obesity. So then I start to think about public health and trees, and I have been following the literature, so I know that people talk about trees and skin cancer. So if we're shading those biking and walking paths, are we helping to cut down on skin cancer? I know how people talk about trees and ADHD, so can I weave that story? And of course, by encouraging biking and walking, are we working to combat childhood obesity and the diabetes that goes along with it and respiratory illnesses? So again, to a non-tree person, the connection between trees and public health is not immediately obvious, but I can weave that story and help them understand how trees are in fact a part of, can in fact suit the goals that they have, even if it's not immediately obvious to them. But I have to tell my story right to do that. So tip number 3 is find and use the checklist. So pretty much every grant application is going to have a checklist. Often it is a bullet pointed list like this of things that must be done. It could be a narrative form, in which case you can just pull out the sentences, but almost always what you see is a bulleted list that tells you, as it says here, all of the following conditions must be met for a proposed project to be eligible for a grant. In this case, this is the California ReLeaf guidelines. And so here is the list. I think in your mind you should turn it, well, not in your mind, you can even do it in real life, turn it into a checklist and make sure that you have every one of those boxes accomplished. And this really ties in with number 2, also about telling your story. So some of the things on this checklist are just really straightforward, practical things that have to be accomplished. So the project has to be located in a disadvantaged community. That either you have or you haven't, and there's no telling a story to get around that fact. It has to be in a DAC, so get that one done. Similarly, at the bottom, you have to comply with all local and county ordinances. Okay, so you have to follow the law. Straightforward. Either you do or you don't. There's no narrative that's going to let you get around that one. But in some of these cases, the bullet points can help you craft your narrative in a way that will help your project be stronger. So this first one with the arrow on it says the project must demonstrate a nexus between an important community need and the benefits the project will provide. So figure out how to do that, and then make sure that in your story, in your narrative, you are making it clear that you have actually done this item on the checklist. And if it's possible to put these into your own bullet points, I say that you should do that as well. So for instance, if there's a question that says, tell us how your project helps meet our goals, then it's fine, I think, most of the time, if the formatting will allow you to do it, to say, our project demonstrates a nexus between the important community, our community has such and such a need, and this project demonstrates a nexus with that by doing X, Y, and Z. And the second arrow there points to another thing that isn't so much about narrative, but it's about narrative, but it's also about planning your project. The project must provide multiple co-benefits. So maybe those are environmental co-benefits, improved air or water quality, maybe they're things like job creation, and they have to relate to the disadvantaged community in question. So this isn't just about crafting the story, but it's also about crafting the project properly. How can you make sure that you're actually accomplishing that bullet point when you plan your project and then when you write about it? And I think I didn't make a little arrow, but farther down there's one that says the project shall include an educational component. So you have to have an educational component. Don't submit your application for this project without one, because the California ReLeaf has told you that they want one. So don't be afraid to find and use the checklist. Similarly, find and use the scoring information. So again, this is from California ReLeaf's proposal. They have a 100-point system, and they're going to use these questions to assess your grant. Now, my brain goes first to the ones that have the most points. So this is a question worth 20 points. It's one that you really want to give your attention to. And the question is, does the project meet the intent of the program? And so this is really what the first few points were about. How do you tell your story in such a way to convince the grantor that your project does meet the intent of the program? What else is on this list? Does the project provide multiple co-benefits? So we talked about that in the last slide. That's worth 15 points. So it's worth giving a lot of attention to, both in the planning, also in the presentation. Now, a little bit farther down are, can quality results be expected from proposed methods and processes? That's another one that's a big 20-pointer. And that's a little bit, I'm getting a message telling me to not talk so fast. Always one of my big failings, so I'll do a better job talking more slowly. So can quality results be expected from the proposed methods and processes? A big question, but that's really a question about whether you have planned and outlined your project in a way that will make it successful. And I think Brian talked a lot about how to do that. And here's your chance to talk. Here's your chance to tell the story about how you've done that, to tell your story about that. All right, and here is another example of the scoring information. This one comes from the Cal EPA grant. And then again, let's jump right to the ones that have the most points. The very most points is letter D over here in the work plan, and it's 25 points. That's the same thing that I just mentioned, and I think the thing that Brian really helps to lay out is here you need to demonstrate that you actually have a really good plan for carrying out your project. Similarly, they're going to give you 20 points for the budget. Again, they're asking you to have done a really good job of figuring out how you're going to spend the money and making sure that you really have accounted for all of the costs. But then there are two down here that really are about telling your story again. There's the number C4, which is the project need. There's 10 points for identifying the program goal and talking about how the project will meet it. And so that's a lot of what we just covered. And then I think here they have a bunch of questions that they've proposed. And I think Brian's suggestion of actually just copying those questions into a Word document and then writing a paragraph underneath them is really helpful in order to make sure that you are actually tackling all of them. And then on the right is letter F, significance and applicability. There are 15 points for that. Provide a description of how the anticipated project results. How will the project be significant? What are the anticipated benefits? And again, here's your chance to really tell the story. This is a Cal EPA grant. It's not a grant for tree people. How do you tell the story of how trees are going to do this job? Now, I don't think you should let the points guide everything. So for instance, the executive summary of the project in the top left only gets 2 points. But I would say it's 2 points or not, it's the absolutely most important 4 or 5 sentences that you'll write, because it's the first thing that people will see, and if it's not good enough, no one's going to really give much attention to the rest of it. So here's just a highlighted example of what that scoring information does. So this is the Active Transportation Program makes public the results of their scoring process for the grants that they gave out in 2015. There are 15 pages of these, so I'm going to guess that there are something on the order of 1,000 projects, no, 150 projects submitted, or maybe even more. I should have counted them. But you can see that the top 3 got 99 points. I'd like to know what they lost their 1 point for if it was the same thing. And there's a whole bunch of them that are above 90. At the bottom, this isn't the complete bottom, there are some in the 20s. So these people obviously did not look at the scoring guidelines and really understand how to get their points, get the maximum out of their points. And this isn't the dead bottom, because the dead bottom actually had a project that had -5, and I couldn't figure out how that could have happened, and I didn't want to call attention to them. That seemed kind of neat. So the scoring information really can help guide you into understanding what they really want from you. And in a lot of these cases, the legislation that enabled the grant requires that the highest scorers, at least, not that they necessarily win, but that the score is a very, very important factor. You're not going to get 23 points and somehow still get your project funded. So really give a lot of attention to that. Tip number four, be creative in your partnerships. And so there's a bunch of reasons for this. One is to improve your project. So all of these grants that we're talking about today have a component associated with disadvantaged communities. And rightly or wrongly, the urban forestry community has not been renowned for its ability to outreach to those kinds of communities. So to make a better project and also to improve your credibility, it's very helpful to have partners that have the kind of experience that we're lacking in that realm. So don't be afraid. It's obviously best if you've been working on building these kinds of friendships and partnerships over time, but here's an opportunity to possibly reach out to new groups and say, we've got this project in mind, and we would love to partner with you. Maybe this is our chance to do some work together the first time. So it really is a chance both to make the project better and to make it clear that you are working to accomplish those goals that maybe are not the primary thing in your wheelhouse. So similarly, like active transportation, I think a project that came straight from a tree nonprofit advocacy group that didn't have any partners that were biking and walking partners is not going to look like as strong of a project as one where it's clear that you've already reached out to the relevant community and gotten their input. Being creative in your partnerships can also help expand your options. So for instance, a couple of years ago, I had a project that I really wanted to do was to build the tree key to help people identify urban trees. And I am a sole proprietor consultant, so I was not able to apply for any grants where the grant applicant has to be a nonprofit or a state agency or whatever. But I thought this was a great project that a lot of people would like. So first I reached out to the Urban Forest Ecosystems Institute, which is a part of Cal Poly, and the first response was, well, Cal Poly is also not a nonprofit, but then we realized that Cal Poly has an associated nonprofit institute whose sole purpose for being, I think, is to allow them to apply for grants. So Eufy and I got together and we got the Cal Poly Institute to be the fiscal sponsor for this project. So that was one partner. And then the second partner was, it was suggested to us that we might call upon Dr. Matt Ritter at Cal Poly, the botanist who's kind of really quite famous now in California for his tree identification work, to help us figure out which trees to focus on and then to figure out how to do the key itself. And so it became 1,000 times better of a project, and it became feasible. It became 1,000 times better because I had the support of Matt Ritter and also the support of Eufy, and then it became feasible because now all of a sudden we had a potential fiscal sponsor that could help us. And finally, be creative in your partnerships to improve financing. So I don't know if Brian mentioned this, but it can be very challenging if you're a small nonprofit and you are going to apply for a grant for, say, $50,000 to plant a bunch of trees, or a grant for $2 million, but let's even keep it small. It's even challenging at the small scale sometimes. Your vendors, the people selling you the trees and digging the holes and laying the irrigation, are going to expect to be paid within 30 days. What's going to happen is they're going to submit an invoice to you, and you are going to turn around and submit that invoice to the state agency that's involved, and that state agency is not going to do anything for a long time. But meanwhile, the man with the irrigation company is still waiting to get paid. So it can be very helpful if you have a fiscal sponsor that has a little bit better of a cash flow. That person is able to actually turn the money around before they get paid by the state agency. Speaking as a contractor who has done plenty of work on these kinds of grants, I don't actually expect to get paid in 30 days when I do this kind of work because I know how it works, but it certainly is a weight off of everyone's mind if you're not all biting your fingernails when the state is taking 3 months to turn the money around. So keep your mind open to partnerships where somebody else is in charge of the financing. It can really be advantageous for you. Okay, number 5, don't miss hidden opportunities. So the first thing I said was make sure that your project is about the grant, it meets the grant objectives in the broad picture. But that doesn't mean that within any given grant there aren't smaller opportunities to accomplish your other goals. So for instance, the California ReLeaf grant specifies that they'll maintain trees during the grant period. That's pretty uncommon. So don't be afraid to ask for money to do that. And also it might be something that you'd want to think about when you're organizing your project. The earlier you get the trees in the ground, the more years you have where you can call upon some money for maintenance. If you're planting the trees at the very end, the grant period ends, in this case, in 2019. If you plant your trees at the end of 2018, you're not going to be able to take advantage of this opportunity. So it's not really hidden, it's just subtle, and you can forget to think about these things. And similarly, here's the CAL FIRE grant talking about education and signage. So first of all, you're required to have an education component, and then it says that the amount that you request for education can't exceed 20% of the grant, and it needs to be relevant to the scope of the proposed project. So the minimum request for these CAL FIRE grants was $150,000. That means on even the smallest grant, you could theoretically ask for up to $30,000 for education. That's a huge amount of money. If you were doing the $750,000 ask, you could be asking for $150,000 of money for education. Now, that's the maximum. So I don't know that that would have made for a competitive grant, but it means that you shouldn't hesitate to put a decent amount of money into your request, into this aspect of it. And so here's your chance to think a little bit outside the box. Perhaps you've wanted to develop curricular materials for middle schools related to trees. Well, that's certainly something that you can make a part of the scope of the proposed project. You can tell that story in a way that will work very nicely. Maybe you were interested in making pamphlets that would be passed out at Arbor Day events. Maybe, for instance, your nonprofit website is not very good, and here is your chance to say, well, we're going to build out our website and use in an educational way and in a community outreach way, and perhaps this grant can actually be used to make some fundamental changes to your website if in the end result what results out of it is something that's relevant to the scope of the proposed project. So finally, number 6, don't make it easy to reject you. And so this I'm going to highlight with a story from my checkered past that has a lesson that has stayed with me for all these years. Way back when I was in high school, I had a good GPA and good SAT scores, and so I thought I was quite hot stuff. And in fact, I got a lot of prospectuses from colleges that were that I hadn't asked for. So they were reaching out to me without me having reached out to them. And sometimes by the end of the week, there would be this stack with like 20 college brochures in it and letters to me. And my mother would get all irritated and say I had to go through them and figure out what to do. And so my process was, if there was a single mistake in their outreach to me, I threw it in the trash. So if they didn't spell my name right, it went in the trash. If it just said, "Dear prospective student," I threw it in the trash, because what kind of college can't even set up a database properly so that they can put my name on this letter? In the trash. And it was mostly just because I was overwhelmed by the amount of material. I had to find a way to get the first layer gone. And I've always imagined people in similar situations having the same reaction. So when you're applying for a job or when you're applying for a grant, don't make it easy for you to be the thing that gets thrown in the trash. So if, as here for the Cal EPA instructions, they say they have to be double-sided, they have to be numbered consecutively, they have to be single-spaced with 1-inch margins and 12-point font, minimum 12-point font. Don't mess that up. It's a stupid, easy mistake to make, but it's an easy way to end up in the trash. And you're probably telling yourself, well, I'm going to sneak in an 11-point font because my story is so compelling, I have so much to say, no one will notice that I've done this. But the person reading it is thinking, I have 100 of these applications to go through. This person didn't even respect the things that will make my life a little bit easier. Why should I assume that they're going to respect the rest of the process? They probably, I don't know if they would really throw you in the trash for this, but they're not going to have a good feeling about you. So don't make it easy to reject you. Another mistake that I see being made a lot is on the deadline. So they always have a different, complicated way of setting a deadline. This EPA grant has to be mailed or hand-delivered. It has to be received by 4 p.m. on January 22nd. So that's not postmarked. That means you have to make sure that somehow that it gets there by 4 o'clock on January 22nd. Don't put it in the mail on January 21st and hope that it's going to arrive comfortably. Make sure you account for that. But more importantly, make sure you've read this piece, because it's always different. So here, for instance, is CAL FIRE's rule. And it's clear to me that they've had a lot of problems because they reiterate this in like 6 different ways. Must be submitted electronically by November 13th. Late submissions will be rejected, no exceptions. And late to them is by 11:59 on November 13th, according to CAL FIRE's email system. So that means your computer could say 11:59, but theirs could say 12:01, and you will not make it. So especially with these kinds of electronic submissions, leave yourself plenty of extra time, because this CAL FIRE system is not as simple. It's not you're just sending an email. You have to actually click a button that somehow saves your application in a way that only CAL FIRE understands, and then sends an email. And things have gone wrong with this in the past. Expect that things will go wrong for you this time. And make sure that you leave plenty of time for that kind of challenge. So that was it, my 6 tips for grant applications. I think Chuck has a little bit more for us, and then I'll be here with any questions at the end. Melissa, I just lost my thing. Will you take it away?
Okay. So we're back. And thank you so much, Kelaine and Brian. Really valuable information. And so I'm going to just finish up here with 3 final tips. They're really straightforward. Some would even just again say, well, these are common sense. Why wouldn't I do this? I'm trying to come at this from the perspective of, at our office, I write our public grants. I also write our grant guidelines, and I also administer our grants that I've written the guidelines for. So I see this from multiple perspectives, and so I'm just trying to identify some very common themes as a grant writer and as a grant administrator that I think just are worth some reiteration, even if they do seem fairly self-explanatory. So the very first one, again, all these are going to seem like, well, why wouldn't I do this? But read the grant guidelines and read them completely. As someone who writes the grant guidelines for California ReLeaf, I can tell you I have two goals. My first is to make it as simple as possible, as easy as possible for the grantee to apply for these funds. These are generally smaller grants, but they still take a lot of time, not only to apply for, but then once you're administering, like Brian said, there's tracking the receipts, making sure you're delivering on the project. And it's really up to me to make sure that we're trying to provide you the most streamlined grant application possible. At the same time, I need to be very inclusive of what we have been told by the state government or the public agency that's giving us these funds for these pass-through purposes, what needs to be accomplished in these grants. So in the case of the most recent grant guidelines that Kelaine just spoke about for social equity tree planting, these are very different from our tree planting grants in the past in that they have to contribute to reducing GHGs, and they have to meet certain disadvantaged community criteria. All of the grants do. So putting that in while still maintaining the overall flavor of what we've done before with urban forestry grants, as a grant writer, or as a grant guideline writer, that can be a real challenge. And so one of the things that I'm always seeking to accomplish is find that balance. And you'll see the sample that I give up here as a tip as to why it's so important to read the grant guidelines is this is a lesson that we learned about a year ago when we were applying for the CAL FIRE grants that were funded by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. We applied for 2 grants. We were toward the end of them. We'd read the request for proposals. We'd looked over the procedural guide, which was different from the request for proposals, a longer document, in fact, than the RFP. And we were pretty much in the home stretch. And I decided to look at the checklist in the procedural guide that applies to all RFPs to make sure we hadn't missed anything. And sure enough, in that checklist, we had covered everything, but right above that checklist, not in boldface, not called out in any particular way, was what I've put up here on the screen. This example of how every project needs to have a description of grantee qualifications, a list of similar types of projects, qualifications of each of the leads and supporting personnel, and the time to be worked on. This was a very large document, and fortunately we had followed Kelaine's advice and had not cut this down to the wire, but seeing this, we had to assemble, I think, a good 2 or 3 pages of narrative, not only on our previous experience in doing this, but all the people involved in it. We had 5 partners in this application that we had to not only account for their expertise and why we had their pertinent to the grant, but then how we were going to break down our time, which was a separate worksheet that our executive director put together. When all in all was done, we had about a 14-page addendum to our grant application that was just this question that was a little bit hidden in the procedural guide. You know, when I talked to folks afterwards, these were competitive grants. A lot of folks that I think thought they had a really good chance. I asked, did you include in this and this? And they said, oh, no, I didn't see that. And I think that's kind of an important lesson for us to learn is, you know, as someone who wrote the grant guidelines that hopefully some of you will be applying for, you know, I put everything in there for a reason. And, you know, certainly when you're looking at other public grants, I would encourage you to make sure that you're going them over thoroughly because something like this can really make a huge difference. This one's kind of new, and it goes to what I was saying earlier in that is really kind of finding its footing in the world of public grants and public policy by saying more and communicating more to decision makers, to those that have the funds, to those public agencies that are doing grants. Trees are great, and I think for a while, you know, that was kind of the mantra. And now what we're seeing is that if we can break that down into language that is pertinent to what's happening in the realm of public policy, then we can make a clearer argument for each grant as to why we're applying for that particular fund. And so, as Kelaine said, you know, when we're applying for an active transportation grant, we're going to be talking about the shading benefits of making sure that we've got trees and other vegetation along those non-motorized trails. Probably not going to be talking as much about adaptation. That's going to be more for, you know, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And so we've got this whole new vocabulary. I wouldn't say that it's new, but it's new to the idea of becoming more commonplace in the way we speak about trees. And it certainly can seem like a jumble, but I think the more we embrace that language and educate people about what we're talking about in our grant application process, then I think that's going to help us continue to differentiate how we do a grant on active transportation versus environmental justice versus climate resiliency and air quality. All these things are being looked at right now as public grant funding opportunities, and it's a matter of learning the lingo to make sure that we're making the best case in each of those grants. And then finally, the idea of researching previously funded projects. This goes a little bit to something that one of our presenters said when we were developing this grant was creating a bucket list for your projects. And that the idea is that, have some projects waiting in to be able to plug into the right grant. Well, sometimes looking at the guidelines or even looking at the synopsis of a grant program, you're not going to be entirely sure, does my project fit? And we've certainly had this case at California ReLeaf, and I'll give an example. And more public agencies in particular are posting on their websites the previous grantees, who was funded in the past, brief description of those projects, the amount of funds, where they're located, some pictures sometimes. And I found that to be a really helpful tool. Kelaine spent a fair amount of time talking about the environmental justice grants that are going through Cal EPA. Well, this year, as she mentioned, there's a new category, and it relates to climate change. And you need to look at some of the previous projects to get an understanding of, well, not necessarily what they're looking for in terms of urban forestry or urban greening to meet climate change goals, but the types of projects in general that they funded. And I was really surprised to go on that website and see that there are a lot of grants for maybe $20,000 that were convenings, that were meetings, that were forums. That really encouraged community leaders to bring other community participants together in some kind of forum to address some of the needs that are highlighted in those Cal EPA grants. So I know some of the network members that we've worked with when we've talked to them about these grants, they were unaware of that, and they're saying, this is exactly what we need. We really struggled to be able to put together the funding to get together a forum to share ideas on how we affect environmental justice in disadvantaged communities through our project on stormwater management or on air quality or landscaping. And that's one example where it really pays to go look at the types of projects that are being funded. And the example that I give for California ReLeaf is that a couple years ago, an opportunity was presented by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency where they were doing environmental education grants. And when I first saw this, I thought, well, this probably isn't for us, but I'll poke around. And I read the description, and when I was done with the description, I still wasn't completely convinced that there was a role for us, but I kept coming back to the idea that the environmental education components on these particular grants had to tie back to either climate change, protecting our local environment through stormwater management and water capture, and environmental justice. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, well, I wonder if there is a case to be made here. And I poked around a little bit more, and I finally got to the page where there were previously funded projects along the same vein from the EPA. And sure enough, there was a project in New York that had been funded maybe 5-6 years prior that directly related to urban forestry and the environmental education around urban forestry and outreach to youth in New York, demonstrating the value of urban forestry as it related to these issue areas and others. Sure enough, this was enough for us to say, we think we have a case to be made here. We applied for the grant, and we received it. And in fact, we were the only applicant to receive a grant in Region 9 of EPA. So that really came from digging a little bit, looking at the previously funded projects, and going forward from there. Again, very basic idea, but one that I think has proved valuable to us in the past, and certainly encourage you to do that when you're moving forward. With that, we wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. I think we do have enough time to do that, so I'm going to stop talking. Thank you, everyone, for participating. We look forward to fielding your questions. Melissa's going to facilitate that, and we can get right into it. Melissa?
Hey, oh, I was on mute. Hi, everyone. I think we have a few minutes for questions. I'm not currently seeing any, but if you do have one, go ahead and click the raised hand button or type your question into the question box and we can field it to our speakers. Thank you so much for our speakers again. That was wonderful, really informative. And for those of you who are here, this webinar is being recorded and we'll put it online at our website and share it on our social media sites so that you all have access to it, and send it out in an e-blast so you can share it with your communities as well. You can also email us questions that come up later, since I'm still not seeing any. We are available info@californiareleaf.org, or if the speakers had up their email addresses and you jotted those down, those are available. This isn't a question, it's a comment. Excellent, excellent program. Thank you. We have our work cut out for us from Suzanne. Thanks, Suzanne. Lots of work to do indeed, but it sounds like lots of good projects coming down the pipe. All right, if we don't have any more questions, then I think we can go ahead and wrap this up. Thanks again to all our speakers and our listeners for being here on the work you are planning to do in your communities and the steps you're taking to make that even better. We really appreciate this, and we can catch you again, more questions online, and this webinar will be online at californiareleaf.org. Anything else, Chuck?
No, thanks again to our participants. We appreciate you being on the call, and have a great holiday. And if you have any questions, particularly related to our grants, which are due January 19th, you can call me or email me. And again, much thanks to Kelaine and Brian for joining us this morning as well.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.